starting with the Thursday night matchup between the Giants and the Philadelphia Eagles. And believe it or not, I actually feel as though there is more fantasy football value heading into this game than I think most people would recognize. I mean, we look at it right here. We start on the Giants side of the ball. Devonta Freeman, he doesn't have a great matchup, right? He comes into the week for us for RB27. We don't really love it. Obviously, Fletcher Cox is still playing. Obviously, the Giants' offensive line has still been horrendous, let's say at best. Obviously, he's not a great play to begin with, but because he's been getting the volume, you've been having to play him as a flex play. You've been having to play him as an RB2 bye week injury fill-in. At 27 on the week, I pretty much am telling you that I have him in the same category as any other week that you would for this. So you can play Freeman. I don't feel great about it. You have to temper your expectations. Unless he falls into the end zone, getting double-digit points is going to take all 4 quarters of him touching the football, which has happened to this point. But obviously, not super excited. You may not have better options, though, because we're getting hit hard on buys again this week with 4 teams on bye. Daniel Jones, I don't think I had to talk about Daniel Jones anymore at this point. I think finally everybody has come to my side of the aisle on Daniel Jones, which is he's not a trustworthy quarterback, and he's not a quarterback who possesses a special skill set. In fact, there's no difference between a Daniel Jones and a Mitchell Trubisky. None. Zero. The only difference I will say is that Jones has a little bit of a stronger arm and a little bit more cojones because he's a little bit more willing to throw the deep ball, especially when it comes to Darius Slayton. That's it. That's the only difference between him and a Mitchell Trubisky. That's it. Now, speaking of Darius Slayton, this is probably the guy that people want to know the most about, especially if you have any Giant fantasy football players. We have him at wide receiver 27. You can still play him as a higher end wide receiver 3. It does only take 1 play, but there's 2 reasons why I need to temper your expectations on what Darius Slayton could truly be this week. And both of those are because, one, you have Darius Slay, who's going to be matched up on Darius Slayton. How awesome is that, though? The Slay Bowl, the Slay matchup, the Slay knockout, the Slay boxing match. I love all that. That's all fantastic. But you have those 2 matched up on each other heading into this game. Okay. On top of that, you have Darius Slayton, who was clearly hindered by that foot injury last Sunday. Clearly was. 2 catches, 41 yards. He happens to catch the touchdown. But the second he caught that touchdown is when I realized how banged up, how injured this guy truly was. There was no doubt about it. He came off. He didn't celebrate. He didn't sit there and say, ooh, look at this. I got a touchdown. No touchdown dance whatsoever. He didn't even look that happy about it. Because as soon as he caught the ball, this guy did a 180, and I thought he was about to run off into the locker room. He looked hindered that entire game. And frankly, that's why he didn't have, a bigger performance. That's why he only had 2 catches for 41 yards. He should have been able to take advantage of that on a much higher rate, but just was unable to do so. I worry about Darius Slayton in a Thursday game against Darius Slay. You have to temper your expectations. Is he in that category of can you play him as your flex, as your wide receiver 3? Sure. If I can find another option, if I can avoid it, I probably would, because you have to recognize there's going to be a low floor that comes with Darius Slayton this week as a result of that. There's going to be a low floor. As far as anybody else in the Giants, one interesting note is that Sterling Shepard might be activated before the game tonight. Now, he still actually technically has not been activated from IR, which has led me to believe that he's not going to play tonight. But they are talking about this morning that they may activate him right before the game. They may allow him to play in this one. We'll see. Either way, he doesn't really do anything for you from a fantasy football standpoint. He doesn't boost Daniel Jones. You're not going to be playing him in this matchup either. So we'll see exactly what's able to happen there. Evan Ingram. He comes in at tight end 22 for us. Look, first of all, the Philadelphia Eagles are not a great matchup against the tight ends, even though that's kind of what their reputation was to start the season. And the reason for that is because they had Tyler Higbee go off on them for 3 touchdowns. Outside of that, tight ends really haven't been able to produce that much against the Philadelphia Eagles defense so far. Really hasn't been a thing. And Evan Ingram has been a major disappointment. I mean, this is a guy that we all talked about. Is like, as long as he's healthy, he's going to be good. But no one wanted to draft him because no one expected him to be healthy. He hasn't even gotten hurt yet. And yet, I can't get him inside the top 10. I can't get him inside the top 15 this week. I believe there's a lot of better streaming options for you out there if you're looking for a streaming tight end, where I would not play Evan Ingram this week. Not at all. It's really kind of sad to see, quite frankly. So other than Darius Slayton and Devonta Freeman, if you have to, I don't know if I'm playing another New York Giant in this matchup from a fantasy football standpoint. Now we flip over to the Philadelphia Eagles side of the ball. Carson Wentz. Carson Wentz is a enigma in fantasy football right now because it doesn't look good. He hasn't played well. If you're looking at it from a football standpoint, this has not been a guy that you have wanted to lean on. However, because the last few weeks, and I talked about this, because of the last few weeks, he has been using his legs to make moves. He has been using his legs to try to get going again. He has made himself fantasy relevant. He has made himself a top 10 quarterback. Now, you like the matchup. Deshaun Jackson is going to be back and playing today. That's the good news there. I don't know what else you would have to be. I don't know what else you have to have in order to play Carson Wentz. If you can't play him against the New York Giants, with Deshaun Jackson back, with Travis Fulgham proving that he can at least be a nice fill-in until some of these weapons come back. Zach Ertz wasn't a thing anyway. There's no Miles Sanders tonight, so they're going to have to lean even more so on the passing game, because even if Boston Scott's starting running back, you have him more as a pass-catching weapon out of the backfield than you do as an actual runner. That's something I want to comment on real quick, too. I'm going to be very curious to see how much time Corey Clement gets this week. I'm going to be very curious to see how much time he gets this week, because I think there's a chance here that while Boston Scott might be the starter, they may give Corey Clement the good amount of carry work. They may give him the third and shorts. They may give him the goal line work in this matchup, because Boston Scott hasn't been very impressive this year. Even earlier on in the year when Miles Sanders was missing a few games, he didn't do much then. It didn't look very good. Now, I'm not saying Corey Clement's a special talent or anything like that. Don't get me twisted. But what I am saying is that he's probably a little bit better between the tackles right now than a Boston Scott is. You are going to get Lane Johnson back, so that's at least some good news for the Philadelphia Eagles when it comes to their offensive front. But I know people are going to be jumping at the chance to play Boston Scott this week, and we do have him at RB23, so I do have him at the low-end RB2 area as a spot play, of course, because of the Giants. But I'm not going into this game thinking that I'm going to get Miles Sanders level production. I'm not going into this game thinking that I'm going to get necessarily 15 or more points in a half-point PPR league. I would be happy if I got out of here with 10 or more points with Boston Scott, to be frank, because that's how unimpressive he has been. That's how unimpressive that offensive line has been, and that's the issue. The guy I do want to talk about I have real interest in going into this matchup is Richard Rodgers. I got him at tight end 8 coming into the week. I have him as a top 10 tight end, making him pretty much the top streaming tight end that you can go after this week. For instance, I would rather take the chance on Richard Rodgers being involved and falling into the end zone in today's matchup than playing Evan Ingram. I'd rather play Richard Rodgers. I'd rather take that chance. First of all, it can't get much worse than what we've seen out of Zach Ertz when it comes to separation, when it comes to end zone work, getting past the line of scrimmage. It's been brutal out of Zach Ertz. Absolutely brutal. Richard Rodgers is an okay athlete. He's been around the league for a while. When thrust into a starting position, he has produced in the past. This is the New York Giants. This is a team lacking red zone target. See Richard Rodgers walking away with a touchdown in this game. And you've been streaming tight ends. That's what you've been looking for. That's what you've been looking for. So Richard Rodgers comes in a top 10 tight end. If he's somebody who's on your waiver wire and you've been streaming tight ends, pick him up, play him. Play him over in Evan Ingram. Next up that I want to talk about for this one, of course, is the wide receiver position, right? Sean Jackson comes back. You have Travis Fulgham. Here's the deal with Fulgham. He's going to be matched up on Bradbury. Not that that completely scares me, but Bradbury has been playing pretty well to this point. Enough that because Deshaun Jackson is back, because Carson Wentz will have somebody else to actually throw the ball to, besides, Greg Ward 5 yards past the line of scrimmage. I do wonder how many targets is he looking at? Is he looking at more like 5 or 6 instead of the 7 and 9 that he's seen over the past couple of weeks? I think Fulgham is still worth a play. I still have him as a high-end wide receiver 3, low-end wide receiver 2 coming into this matchup. But I would temper my expectations in that situation as well. Deshaun Jackson, you can't play him. You can't trust him with the first week coming back off the hamstring injury. And before he went out, he wasn't very effective. He wasn't very involved to begin with. But he is somebody I'm keeping my eye on. Why? Well, if he does look healthy, and Carson Wentz does go back to his veteran wide receivers, maybe gives him 5 targets or so, let's say, they do have the Dallas Cowboys next week. So if he looks like he's going to be involved, he looks like he's explosive, it looks like Carson Wentz is looking for him down the field again, he could be somebody that you want to watch this week to see if you want to play him next week. So that's where Deshaun Jackson is interesting to me, but you have to have some major cojones, or you have to be incredibly desperate to take the shot on Deshaun Jackson in tonight's game. Not saying it can't pan out for you, because we all know Deshaun only takes 2 catches and he can bring you in a wide receiver 1 week. But you have to be super confident or in a super desperate situation to really take that chance, because we didn't even see it earlier on this season when he was quote unquote healthy. But I am going to watch it in case I can use him next week against the Dallas Cowboys. That wraps it up for this game. The one quick thing I will mention is Alshon Jeffrey is definitely out. The feeling is that he will be back next week. That had this game been a Sunday game, they probably would have played him this week. But because it was Thursday, they want to give Alshon a little bit more reps in practice before he gets out there. So I do expect to see Alshon Jeffrey next week against the Dallas Cowboys. So let's move on to our first Sunday matchup that we had, our first 1 o'clock game, our first early window of games here on the East Coast, and that's the Detroit Lions and the Atlanta Falcons. A fantasy football wet dream, frankly. You have Matthew Stafford. Hasn't been great, but I got him as a top 5 quarterback coming into this week. The Atlanta Falcons cure all ills when it comes to quarterbacks and fantasy football purposes. They just do. And it's not like Stafford doesn't have weapons. He's got Kenny Golladay. He has I want to say a vampire Marvin Jones. It's beyond the dead at this point, but technically he still should be a guy who can count on to catch touchdowns at some point. You have TJ Hockenson, who we have as tight end 2 this week. That's right. I have TJ Hockenson coming in as tight end 2 because of how the amount of touchdowns the Atlanta Falcons have given up to the tight end position, and because of how much Stafford has been targeting TJ Hockenson this season in the red zone. It hasn't been a thing of beauty between the 20s, but in the red zone, Hockenson's being looked for. And in this matchup, I feel very confident about 1, maybe 2 touchdowns, and I feel pretty confident about him being more involved between the 20s as well. I don't think this is a game in which the Lions are going to be able to do what they did last week, which was, they ran the ball, I believe, 29 times between DeAndre Swift and Adrian Peterson. I don't believe they're going to be able to do the same thing again. Julio Jones is healthy. When Julio Jones is healthy, Matt Ryan plays well. We talked about this last week. When Matt Ryan plays well, the Atlanta offense plays well. When the Atlanta offense plays well in a matchup like this between Detroit and Atlanta, both have defenses known for collapsing pretty much all 4 quarters, but especially in the second half, what you get is a shootout game. What you get is a game in which you're not going to be able to stick with the run. It's going to have to be aggressive. It's going to have to be down the field. So you're playing pretty much everybody. I mean, I'm streaming Stafford as a top streaming option this week. Kenny Golladay is a top 5 wide receiver. TJ Hockenson is a top 3 tight end. The only question I think you have that everyone's trying to figure out is, what do you do about DeAndre Swift and Adrian Peterson? I think in a weird way, you can play both. We have DeAndre Swift here ranked at 24. Of course, we're always talking about this from a half-point PPR standpoint. We have Adrian Peterson ranked at 31. So a low-end RB2 and a flex play, depending on what your bye week issues are. Adrian Peterson is still a guy who can fall into the end zone. Adrian Peterson still received 15 carries last week, even though he was by far the least efficient running back and does not get involved in the passing game. But I offered caution to you guys last week. Obviously, DeAndre Swift was on the waiver wire report, and he was 100% should have been a top pickup if he was available on your waivers. But I offered a word of caution. This game did not definitively signify DeAndre Swift taking over for Adrian Peterson.